So this evening, we have the honor, first of all, welcome everyone, as always, to our Sunday night programming, Fifth Avenue Synagogue lecture series. And we have the honor, once again, to hear from Dr. Larry Norton, the Senior Vice President at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. And of course, we had the privilege to hear Dr. Norton a few weeks ago on a completely different topic on telemedicine, which was a wonderful presentation. And tonight he has a whole new presentation for us on the topic of Maimonides as physician. And we know that in Jewish history, there's a long tradition of rabbis/physicians, whether dating back to the Talmud, and straight through history. Of course, the Rambam being one of the most famous one of these combination of skills. The Talmud is replete with medical advice, as is the writings of the Rambam. So we have an opportunity to understand exactly what this relationship is, historically between the Torah and medicine that seems to have a close relationship between these two fields. To formally introduce Dr. Norton tonight, we have once again Ezra Merkin, Fifth Avenue Synagogue Honorary President, and we want to thank Ezra and Lauren for assisting us in so many ways on the Sunday night programming and to arranging this evening's presentation. Ezra, if we could give you the mic.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Babich, and thank you to Larry, and welcome everybody who's either Zooming in or phoning in. The final Mishnah in the Tractate of Kiddushin is among the more famous Mishnayot in all of the Talmud. It contains a plethora of professional advice. Among other things, Reb Meir says that a person should teach his child a clean and easy profession and pray to the Almighty for sustenance, because wealth and poverty are not determined by one's choice of profession, but by divine decree. Later in the Mishnah, the majority of shepherds and shopkeepers are deemed robbers, whereas most sailors are said to be pious. Rashi explains that shepherds are apt to graze their animals on other people's land. Shopkeepers are known to water down their wine, whereas sailors face hazardous duty and therefore almost always have occasion to tremble before God. Shortly after that, the Mishnah offers up a famous three-word aphorism that must strike terror in the heart of tonight's speaker. The three words are Tov Shebarofim Legehenim. The best of doctors are destined for perdition. In the words of the Maharsha on the daf, on the page, he describes the Tov Shebarofim as Rofei Shemachzik Atzmo L'Tov U'Lemumche Shebarofim She'ein Kamohu. The very top of the profession. There is no one like him. Our speaker's resume, summarized by the rabbi and included in the flyer that you've all seen, our speaker this evening's resume merely confirms his reputation and public standing as the very, very top of his profession, among the very, very best. And so those three words, Tov Shebarofim Legehenim, the best of the doctors are destined for perdition, that apply to so few, surely apply to him. If we turn to Rambam, to the Maimonides commentary on the Mishnah, for an explanation of what this means, we encounter a void. Maimonides, the subject of tonight's presentation, decided not to touch this particular aphorism with a 10-foot stethoscope. Others were not so reticent. And there are fascinating commentaries of Rashi, who actually has three: the Maharsha, the Tiferes Yisrael, the Maharal. Reb Chaim Volozhina has a long piece on this. The Balei Musar all do. It's a very, very discussed Mishnah. For his part, Rashi suggests that the Mishnah is trying to convey that a doctor may become arrogant. He may forget that healing is in the hands of God, and this can lead to mistakes, even to fatal consequences. An interpretation that is very much in line with Rashi, but is somewhat striking, comes from Rabbi Yecheskel Abramsky, a Lithuanian Jew who lived in Siberia, London, and Israel, and passed away, I think, roughly 40 years ago. Rather out of character for a Lithuanian-trained scholar, he resorted to gematrias and said and wrote, Tov Shebarofim means Osam Rofim Shomrim Rak Tov. he takes the word tov and in Jewish numerology presents it as something that is the gematria Yud Zayin. And Yud Zayin, or the number of, the Yud Zayin, the number 17, is the number of brachot, of blessings that we have in the daily Shmona Esrei. So he says, She'ena mispalin b'Shmona Esrei birkas rifa'enu. They don't in their Shmona Esrei recite the text of asking God to cure us. She'en botchin b'Hashem. They don't trust God. Ela kol yisham v'chol chachmasam u'tfunasam. They trust themselves, their insight, their sagacity, and their powers. And therefore, legehenim. Tonight's guest, I think, studiously avoids the danger identified by Rashi and Rav Abramsky. Dr. Norton, whose professional achievements speak for themselves, is a person of deep faith. He has told me once in the decades of our friendship that he cannot discharge his medical responsibilities without the restorative and inspirational impact of regular shul attendance and Torah study. Throughout his career, particularly at significant turning points in his professional development and in his treatment of patients, and in certain personal junctures in his life, he has felt the need for direction from the divine and felt the direction of the divine hand. Tonight, Dr. Norton will speak about another physician, perhaps the most famous in Jewish history, who was directed by the divine hand not only as one of the greatest Jewish scholars ever, but a transformational figure in the history of medicine. I think you will be fascinated and enriched by Dr. Norton's presentation. Let me add that Larry is not only one of the most interesting and most intelligent persons I've ever met in my life, he is also as nice as he is smart. Dr. Norton.
How does one respond to this kind of introduction? I must say is that, well, thank you, Ezra. I hope I live up to some of the advanced words, but I so do appreciate the Torah scholarship because it's extremely relevant to the things that I really want to discuss today. I actually have to put my talk up, don't I? We should have done that, Rachel, before we started. Let me do this and do screen share. We're getting, of course, we'd have trouble opening it. Okay. Can you do screen share for me, or let me see if I could do screen share first.
It should be enabled for you.
Yeah. Let me. Okay. Good. All right. And now let me go to the talk. Good. All right. Ezra gives some hints as to what I'm going to speak about, and I must say it takes enormous chutzpah for somebody. I mean, there's no question about my dedication to Judaism, but I could not, by any conceivable stretch of the imagination, be considered a Torah or a Talmud scholar. But I am an expert in medicine and an expert in biology, and the influence of the Rambam on my personal career has been extraordinary, and I will hint at that as we go forward in the in the lecture. Seminal figure not only in Judaism but actually in medicine, and I would like to really emphasize his importance by talking about him in the context of the history of medicine. You're all very familiar with the let's do it this way. You're all very familiar with the story. His origins are in Andalusia, in southern Spain. A period of great turmoil because of basically the taking over of Spain's Islamic culture by a Berber faction that was really very adamant about conversion. From the time that he was born, either 1135 or 1138, that the literature is really very soft on this. At the age of 10, his family moved around a lot in Andalusia and probably was in hiding for a significant portion of that. And there's even some evidence that they went into Provence. But at age 10, they relocated to what they considered the safer environs of North Africa, particularly the city of Fez, where they were not known, and therefore they could pretend to be outwardly Muslim, so as to avoid persecution. That didn't work for very long, and eventually went into the Holy Land, landing in Accra, and then settled in Cairo about 1185, which puts him in his late 20s. Family catastrophe, again, as everybody knows, his father dies, his brother sinks the family fortune and jewels in a boat accident, and also dies, and he was really left with a whole family to support, and had a year of quote-unquote illness that was probably a major depression from which he came out of, and started practicing medicine. Without having gone to any of the formal medical schools. There were medical schools at the time. The best was in Alexandria, actually in Egypt, not very far from where he was located. There were other physicians who were educated in Alexandria in the medical school in Cairo at the time, many prominent ones. But between the time that he started practicing and over a short period of time, his renown as a physician reached such a level that he was hired as the court physician to Saladin. Saladin was out fighting the Crusaders at the time, so there were other nobles in that court. And that's really where he spent his entire career, and also in a suburb of Cairo as a leader of the Jewish community there. But the majority of his work was really, so this now is late 30s, and then when he starts this, and he starts this kind of adventure into medicine in a very big way. And produced some of the most important observations in medical history, and not just objective facts about biology and medicine, but a much greater accomplishment that we're going to get to as we proceed forward in this talk. But before I do that, I'd like to jump way ahead. And I'd like to jump ahead to these four gentlemen who were John Singer Sargent, famous painting, hangs in the Johns Hopkins Hospital because he's the founders of the Johns Hopkins Hospital. Welch, the pathologist, Kelly, the gynecologist, and Back Halstead, the inventor of the radical mastectomy. In fact, a topic that, as a breast cancer doctor, I'm obviously very immersed in. And sitting right up in front, because he was really the leader of the pack, was William Osler, physician, which means internist, medical doctor, although everybody did a little bit of everything in those days. And Osler is very famous in the history of medicine for his writings, which formed the basis for medical education, and what they call the approach to the patient is usually the name of the course that's given in medical schools. And I'll just give you three of them to illustrate some points. The practice of medicine is an art, not a trade, a calling, not a business, a calling in which your heart will be exercised equally with your head. To study the phenomenon of disease without books is to sail an uncharted sea, while to study books without patience is not to go to sea at all. Live neither in the past nor in the future, but let each day's work absorb your entire energies and satisfy your wildest ambition. So these are the key elements that we teach medical students in terms of their approach to the patient and their approach to medicine. That medicine's a higher calling that involves not just intellectual but emotional engagement in your work, that you have to put evidence that's gained from the actual practice of medicine with patients over dogma that you learn in books, and you have to be able to challenge dogma on the base of evidence, and you have to work hard. You have to make this a central part of your life no matter what else you do. And we're going to get to those points later because these are all attributed to Osler and is taught in medical schools, or is the central principles of medicine that we all abide by. And I just want you to keep the general topic headings in mind as we proceed. So having gone into the 20th century, let's pop back a few years to ancient Egypt to be able to put all of this in context and be able to put Rambam in context. An example in 1552 BCE of the Ebers papyrus, and there are a number of these documents, these papyrus documents that exist from ancient Egyptian culture. This one I like in particular because this happens to be the cure for cancer in hieroglyphs, as you see, and and if it's translated, you find out that it involves some herbal remedies, often based on appearance of the plant, and the connection of the appearance of the plant to the likely benefit that you would expect from the patient. Magical rituals that could be conducted, and incantations. In other words, magic. And this is, clearly the origins of medicine started with basically magic. Not medicinals, not surgical procedures, even though the Egyptians did do surgical procedures, but basically appealing to spirits and often to remove demons as the cause of illness. This one particularly I find intriguing because these are two godlike figures handling some of you may recognize as a marijuana plant. And so obviously they had some knowledge of medicinal uses of plants, not necessarily for constructive purposes. The real beginning of modern medicine starts with the ancient Greeks, who had a god of medicine, and by the way, that is the staff of Asclepius, which is basically a single staff with a single snake, not the caduceus, which is commonly mistaken. And because of the priests of this god were in temples, their function basically was ill people would come to them, often from a large distance, recite their dreams, which would be interpreted by the priests. The priests would give out herbal remedies based on dogma, based on books, scrolls, I guess would be appropriate at that time, as well as behavioral modification, and not based particularly on anything that we would consider modern biology. There was incredible ignorance of anything that we would consider modern biology. This shows the Asclepion in Kos, the island of Kos, which is a Greek island very close to the coast of Greece. And this is a very famous place. It's a postcard from Kos. It's one of the top tourist sites on the island of Kos. And the importance of this was, and it was their temple, is that there was a particular leader of that temple, which is Hippocrates. And Hippocrates broke dramatically from the past, and this was the first great break in the history of medicine, because he broke away from the notion that all illnesses were caused by angry supernatural beings, and thought that they were due to natural causes, and hence sought natural solutions, although he didn't know what those natural solutions were. Largely what they did is they made diagnoses and they prognosticated. His acute awareness of the course of illness invented the concept of a time course of illness, particularly with infectious diseases, which is obviously the major thing that people were sick with in those days prior to antibiotics and basically prior to hygiene, where people would develop fevers and then the fever would break and they'd get better or they wouldn't get better. But he invented and I can't find any real sources before Hippocrates, on this. And if they do exist, and they probably did exist, but nevertheless they were organized by Hippocrates, a certain concept which is really the first major overarching concept in medicine that we know of, which is the concept of the four humors, closely related to the four elements: blood being air, phlegm being water, black bile, and yellow bile, bodily secretions. Hot is a combination of air and fire, for example, and dryness is fire and earth, cold, water and earth, wet is air and water. And so he made an effort to classify diseases in this particular construct. And these were, there's clearly in a kind of a religious element to this, because each of these features are controlled by different deities. And that the anger of those deities could be dealt with, but he really made a break away from that, saying that these things exist because this is the basic of biology, is the four humors. And this is really the beginning of one of the most important things in medicine, which is classification of disease, what we call taxonomy. There's another lecture. This is actually a second lecture that in this series about how taxonomy of disease is starting to rapidly change in the molecular era. That this starts with humors. We're going to go into organ-based disease, which is basically the dominant form of diagnosis and prognostication right now, and is rapidly changing now into molecular medicine, where it's not the organ, but it's the molecules, the DNA, RNA, and proteins that become important. This is itself an extremely interesting topic, but not the topic we can discuss tonight. Now, this was followed in the evolution of medicine by Aristotle. And Aristotle was a great proponent of logic, meaning mathematical logic. A equals B, B equals C, hence A equals C. and much more complex kinds of structures. He didn't have mathematical notation. He expressed it all in words, and his disciples expressed it all in words. But basically, it's reasoning. And he reasoned from examination of animals that the organs must be important because they were important in animals. And it was really the beginning of what we can call comparative anatomy. And in this effort, he became a proponent of the fact that you have to examine, you have to observe the world. You just can't, assume that certain principles that have been established that are abstract or theoretical are going to necessarily apply. And he championed empiricism, the use of the senses over dogma. Why this was important is because he had a great teacher, which is Plato. And he broke with Plato. And you see this is a famous painting by Raphael. You can see in this painting, it makes it very clear, is that Plato is pointing to the heavens, that outside of the body forces involving the gods and involving astronomy, astrology, and involving the pure world that exists, that is really the true world, whereas our perception of the world is a very corrupted world, which is a reflection of the true world. Whereas Aristotle said, no, I'm down to earth. I want to make clean observations. I want to make pure observations. I want to use those observations to logically deduce what's going on. I want to use the concepts of anatomy that I'm learning from looking at animals, at mammalian species, and this is the way to proceed in terms of advances in terms of general knowledge and advances in medicine. So this is actually the very beginning of what we would call evidence-based medicine, medicine that's based on observations and experiments. Now, the experiment method, of course, didn't get discovered until much later, 18th century. But that, in terms of actually doing controlled experiments, but the concept of actually using observations and experience to make medical decisions and learning from one patient to the other in that regard, this really starts with Aristotle. It reaches this culmination in the work of Galen several centuries later, and this is a statue of him in Pergamon, which is this incredibly beautiful city, a Hellenic city that's in Turkey, where he was born to a very wealthy family, and he traveled extensively. He did go to medical school in Alexandria, eventually settled in Rome. And Galen took this to the ultimate and became the basis for the kind of medicine that future physicians in the earlier part of our history of medicine, and probably even today, rely upon. He did extensive work. The Romans prohibited dissections of human bodies, so he worked in animal species, and he made incredible observations in terms of blood circulation, the nerves, the organization of the spinal canal, musculature, and wrote extensively on this particular topic. He was predominantly a surgeon and not a medical person, but he still did bloodletting, which was based on the four humors. Too much blood gives you certain illnesses. You take some of the blood away, and you could reverse that. And based on that diagram that I showed you earlier, and his major effort was to try to unify the idealization of Plato, the theory of the four humors that Hippocrates had established, and Aristotle's approach to logic. And he struggled very mightily with those efforts. There were two, and hundreds of conclusions came from this that were extremely valuable for medicine for centuries upon centuries thereafter. But two that I find particularly intriguing is that he took the four elements and he actually linked them to personality types. So we talked about people being sanguine or choleric or melancholic or phlegmatic, the social people, passionate people, charismatic people, creative people, loving people. And he linked those to the four elements that he thought imbalances in these, or particularly predominance of one over the other, would actually determine personality. And so this is the first really systemization of psychology in this, and actually linking psychology to to things that can be measured, such as blood circulation. The second is strong arguments about the structure of the soul. And he came to the conclusion the soul was not of two parts, which many had believed, but rather of three parts. And by the way, everything I'm saying here has a relevance in terms of even modern theories to this day. Freudian theory is a three-part theory of the mind, for example. But he thought that the rational part of the soul was in the brain, which was really a remarkable statement because many people thought it was in the lungs. The spiritual part of the soul was in the heart, and we still use that today, using the heart as a symbol of emotionality and higher spiritual feelings, and appetite being in the liver, which is also very insightful in terms of the liver being very important for digestion. And the important part of this is that it was the very beginning of organ-based medicine. So taxonomy starting with Hippocrates, and then evidence-based medicine with Aristotle, and then Galen going to organ-based medicine. And this formed the real structure of medicine for many years, and probably even to the current day, as I said, where we're still very organ focused. I'm a breast cancer specialist, all right? That's an organ. I'm not a specialist in PI3 kinase per se, wherever that mutation may occur. And I think that we are, which is a molecule that is mutated in many cancers. And we may see an evolution away from this approach as the science takes us. Again, it's another conversation, but it's, I think, an intriguing one to me. And then we get into medieval Europe. And in medieval Europe, two things happen. One is there's essentially no advance after Galen. All the physicians are basically using that, if they're using it at all, because there was in Europe, in Christian Europe, a tremendous emphasis really on faith and in penance, and a return to the concept. And this is Saint Sebastian, who was shot with arrows and survived, but was later killed as a martyr, pleading to Jesus about this person's falling sick, taking care of the ill with the plague in the latter half of the 16th century, beginning of the 6th century, beginning of the 7th century. And the notion of illness being something that is really outside of the biology, as poorly understood as that was, of the individual. Demonology, you see even in this painting, there's demons here that are actually the cause of this person's illness, and so on. This was carried from throughout Europe by monks who traveled and who spread the word. One in particular I find particularly intriguing in this regard is Saint Gall from Ireland, who traveled extensively and eventually settled down in Switzerland. There's a picture of him on the Bodensee, which is Lake Constance, in Switzerland. This is actually the abbey in St. Gallen, with the cathedral. The reason why this is particularly relevant to me is that for many, many years, we had a meeting every 2 years in St. Gallen, Switzerland, bringing together all the experts in breast cancer in the world to discuss certain aspects of breast cancer therapy, adjuvant therapy, in fact, treatment of primary disease. And I would attend those lectures, but I'd also spend a lot of time here in the Abbey because of their extraordinary medieval library, where a lot of the books, were kept. You had to be very careful what you touched, of course, you need special permission, but an extraordinary experience. And the reason why that's really relevant is because although there was no real progress in medicine during this period of time, there was extensive storing of the information. There was preservation of the great books of the past. Galen was translated into many different languages, obviously Latin being the predominant one for this particular purpose, the works of Hippocrates. And so the accumulation of this knowledge in libraries was extremely important, and if it were not for that, all of those works would have been lost. This shows a very popular herbal of the time in the Middle Ages. This is interesting, obviously, because of the fact that it shows the plant, which is a carrot, and it shows characteristics of the carrot and how it could be used medicinally. But also, you can see, that sometimes things, die very hard. The notion of herbs being important for you, not because of any kind of experience in what they actually do when they're administered to people who are healthy or sick, but rather because of their appearance. You can see that this is a very interesting carrot because of its appearance, and that notion was even carried out even throughout these herbal books, and we'll have more to say about that in a second. Now, toward the latter part of the Middle Ages, however, there was a tremendous resurgence of what we would call the modern development of medical thinking. But it wasn't really happening in Europe. Europe was continuing to develop knowledge of plant products and their medicinal properties, with some association with therapeutic benefit that could be discerned by giving it to patients and watching what was observed. But the real advances were happening outside of Europe. This is Ibn Sina. Avicenna is the common name that he's known by, who was a Persian physician, born in Kazakhstan, I think, but worked in Iran, who again worked on unifying Galen, Hippocrates, and Aristotle. And you can see that's a common theme going through all of this history of medicine, is how do we take the wisdom of Galen, which we are all applying based on the work of Hippocrates, and how do we reconcile that with the work of Aristotle? And he made a tremendous effort to organize and summarize all medical knowledge. And so this is the familiar diagram that I showed you of the four humors and the four elements and how they relate. But he started connecting this to something that would be considered modern observation of disease. Hot, inflammation, thirst, fast pulse. It's worse in the summer because people are very hot. Dry would be insomnia, rough skin, fatigue, and worse in the autumn. Is the wet diseases are lassitude, salivation, diarrhea. And the cold diseases would be things like arthritis, rheumatism, which is well described, poor digestion, and general body fatigue and weakness. And so you start to see some modern terminology and modern thinking starting to lay on top of purely theoretical considerations, which would have to be considered the dogma that would be inherited from the Greek tradition. This work was extremely important for this man, Averroes, who was a physician, again, in the very latter part of this period. And if you look at those dates, you remember the dates of Ramban, this is important. And he was a very charismatic, obviously excellent physician, was well sought over, and also administrator and politician, and did many other things, but a big proponent of applying Aristotelian logic in medicine, and starting to diverge a little bit from the rigid dogma of Hippocrates in this setting. And the reason why he's important in this story is because of where he was. He was in North Africa, and it was in Fez that he was in contact with a very young Moshe ben Maimon. No formal education as far as we can tell, but certainly books were offered, conversations were offered, there was some training. It's very clear that Maimonides was somebody that was very interesting to speak with, and people would seek him out because of his intelligence and his insights, and probably his personality as well. And so this was the origin. And so you see what he's inheriting. He's inheriting the efforts to apply Aristotelian logic to the works of Hippocrates and Galen, being touched by a charismatic, gentle, kind physician who, with extensive world experience, who was guiding him in practical matters. And then you know the story. After a period of time in this part of the world, he then moves eventually to Egypt. Now, what does the Rambam actually do? And obviously, we're not going to rehearse, what he means in terms of Judaism. He wrote 10, through Mishnah Torah and through many of his works, there's specific medical advice, as we know. But he wrote 10 specific treatises on medical topics. And he wrote them all in the last 20 years or so of his life, where he was really focused, and especially in the last 10 years of life, really focused on medicine as the thing that he wanted to accomplish the most. He started with basically extracting Galen and taking the concepts from Galen that he thought were most important and putting them in a form that could be readily used by the practicing physician rather than the extensive volumes that Galen had produced at that time. Did the same thing with Hippocrates, and actually there's an evolution of his work from that time, because now it gets back to aphorisms, which is specific advice under specific circumstances, with heavy commentary. I mean, just like Talmudic commentary, heavy commentary on the observations and explanation of what they really meant, not their plain form, but their real intention and what Hippocrates really meant by this work, which is actually quite interesting because most people took it as dogma without further interpretation. And then started coming up with observations of his own on the best way to treat certain diseases. At that point, he was very, very prominent, obviously, in the court. People were coming to him from all over, and he took care of Jews, and he took care of, obviously, working in the court of Saladin, took care of Muslims as well. and Christians. Richard the Lionhearted tried to recruit him to come back to England with him and be his court physician. Of course, he was not going to leave his Jewish community in Fostat, which is the suburb about a mile and a half away from the center of Cairo. So he had to actually do some work that was relevant to the people that he was taking care of, particularly the nobles. So he wrote a treatise on hemorrhoids, very, very anatomical in terms of what they mean and the best way they can be taken care of, and also great attention to the implications of this illness on well-being, what we call wellness, and advice in terms of diet and exercise that would be relevant to that topic. A treatise on male sexual behavior. He'd never treated women, by the way. Male doctors didn't treat females in Egypt. So a book about healthy sexual behavior. Asthma, because of a nobleman who had terrible trouble breathing. And this is the first real mention that I can find that asthma could be related to air pollution. Cairo was a very polluted city, and when you can only get your heat and light from burning things, you're gonna have an extremely polluted environment, and a description of the importance of actually getting away from that if one's going to treat that disease. A treatise on poisons and antidotes to those poisons. That was actually used in Europe for hundreds of years as a text in pharmacology, and extremely erudite. And poisoning was rampant in those days, and being able to protect you, especially if you're in a position of power, to protect yourself from that was obviously extremely important. And then branching into preventative medicine, diet and exercise. And the dietary advice and the exercise advice is absolutely almost exactly what we'd recommend today with all the research that we've gone into this field in terms of the things to eat and being plant products mostly, and the importance of exercise, the importance of rest. A nobleman had seizures, so he wrote about that. And then he did something that I thought was really one of the most remarkable at all from a purely medical point of view, which is that there were a lot of natural products that were being used, and nothing you can call synthetic, but a lot of chemistry that was going on to various mixed things, and it created a tremendous amount of confusion. So he developed a glossary of drug names with some hint of their utility, but linked to other sources that would talk about that. But because physicians spoke many different languages, he wrote in Arabic, Greek, Syrian, Persian, Berber, and Spanish. Interestingly enough, not Hebrew. Now, you may know that most of his writing, especially his medical writing, of course he wrote some things in Hebrew, but most of his medical writing was actually in Judeo-Arabic, which is a kind of a pidgin language between Hebrew and Arabic, and had to be some of the work like Guide to the Perplexed had to be Guide for the Perplexed had to be translated to Hebrew. So that, but Hebrew was left out of this. Nobody's really quite sure why. But this was an enormous undertaking, and this actually existed as the textbook for medicinal plants, basically for evidence-based herbalism in Europe for 400 years. But that's not what I want to talk about. So I've talked a little bit about the ancient world for a very particular reason, and a little light on the actual specifics of his achievements in medicine, because I want to concentrate in the limited time that we have on something that I think really is more important in that. And that is that throughout this history of medicine, up until Rambam, you have this divide. You have the Platonic view that it's all really in the heavens, and there's a pure world out there that our senses is seeing a corrupted version of it, an incomplete or distorted version of it. You have people praying to God or gods as their primary, not as a secondary means of treating illnesses. And then you have the Aristotle revolution, where we're talking about earth and the importance, and not just plants that grow in the ground, but basically the importance of biology, the importance of people in terms of personality, the importance of observation, of evidence, of challenging dogma, and culminating in further development of these ideas in the Arab and the Persian physicians that Maimonides was in contact with. And this divide still exists today, as we know. And maybe if we have a little bit of time for discussion yet, we can talk about that. I mean, should I take a medicine or should I atone? Has this been brought upon me because I'm an evil person, and if I'm a better person, will I get better? And many other examples that I'm thinking, it's running through everybody's mind at the time that we all can sort of think about. The question is, can you bring them together? And this is the revolutionary change, in addition to all the specific accomplishments that Rambam accomplished in terms of, achieved in terms of medicine. This is an act of genius, is to be able to bring together the earthly and the divine and unite them in the practice of medicine. Now, I can't do better than to actually quote Rambam because he writes so well. But he came up with a religious justification to study and practice medicine that was evidence-based and also organ-based. And he did it with, I think, just a totally brilliant stroke. He saw medicine as a fulfillment of a biblical obligation to return lost objects to their owner. I'll give you his quote on that in a second. He also stated that it's imitating God, that a healthy lifestyle fulfills an individual's obligation to promote their own health, and he thought this was to be achieved by the golden mean, which is a balance between things. Now, this is obviously a thought that is a balance between humors, but it goes way beyond a balance between the humors, because it basically says, yes, you have to eat, but you can't eat too much. You can drink some wine, but you can't drink too much. You can exercise, but you don't have to exercise to the point of making yourself sick. And the idea of a balanced life was as a path to health, he thought was an obligation to God. And moreover, that just the study of the natural sciences, as opposed to just the study of the text, which obviously he was a giant in, is a tool to recognize love and to fear God. So Rambam on higher calling, quote, because it is a religious duty, that is to say, a physician is obligated by law to heal the sick of Israel, and I took care of non-Jews as well. And this is included in what the sages said in explanation of the verse, and you shall restore it to him, to include his body, that if he saw him lost and he can save him, he must save him with everything that he can bring forward, knowledge, his own efforts, his own body, his own money. But it's an obligation to restore health as a commandment to give somebody something they lost. They lose their health, and you have an obligation to restore it. The art of medicine is given a very large role with respect to the virtues, the knowledge of God, and attaining true happiness. To study it diligently is among the greatest acts of worship. That's probably the most important sentence in my life. For it enables us to perform our actions so they become human actions, as opposed to, let's say, building a chair or something that is building an inanimate object. It's human actions, and that's what leads to virtues and to truths. It's a commentary in the Mishnah. There is no greater joy and no greater glory than the joy of gladdening the hearts of the poor, the orphans, the widows, and strangers. Indeed, he who causes the hearts of these unfortunate to rejoice emulates the divine presence, of whom Scripture says to revive the spirit of the humble and to revive the heart of the contrite ones. Therefore, it becomes a religious duty and more than an obligation. It becomes a central part of Torah-directed behavior. In terms of emotional engagement, I am he who prefers to address the single man by himself and do not heed the blame of these many creatures. This was based really on the observation that when people get depressed or when they get crazy or they get paranoid, they can be ostracized and they can remove themselves from the community. He says, I'm drawn to that. I want to liberate the virtuous one from that into which he has sunk, and guide him in his perplexity until he becomes perfect and is healed. The term healing in terms of in terms of health, in terms of medicine. So this is a clear example of psychology, of psychosomatic medicine in some cases, and of psychological medicine, and of immersion into this relationship, regardless of what the people around think. They say, stay away from this guy, he's crazy. No, that Rambam says, no, it's my obligation to try to bring him back to health, because mental health is as important as physical health. In terms of evidence over dogma, again, this contrast between Aristotle and Plato, I shall explain some large general aspects of the works of the sovereign of the universe. They may serve the intelligent individual as a door to the love of God. So now it's not a it's not a discrepancy to study biology or to study the natural world. It's not saying that's taking you away from your primary obligation, which is to study the deities, or to or to pray, or to do penance. Those have their place, but there's also an obligation to learn about the natural world, even as our sages have remarked in connection with the theme of the love of God. Observe the universe, and hence you'll realize him who spoke and the world was. So this uniting of the spiritual and the organic is something that we're still fighting with today. This is not over. This battle is not over, and I think this can absolutely bring them together, and putting them this way was very influential, not only in the Jewish world and in the Islamic world, but also in the Christian world in the centuries after Rambam. And really had an enormous influence. But it's still something we're fighting today. And so the reason is, how did I get involved in this, the rabbi asks, is because there was a tremendous controversy at one time in my field of breast cancer, which is, what's the right dose of chemotherapy? And people were pushing to extraordinary high doses that were making people very sick, indeed 6-7% mortality rates from the treatment itself. And I wrote about this, and it was a controversial editorial that I wrote in the Journal of Clinical Oncology. I just assumed the presidency of the American Society of Clinical Oncology. I was in a position where I could perhaps influence this debate. And I said, people often ask me, how do I protect myself from unfounded medical recommendations? My advice to them is to respond to any opinion from any healer, no matter how seemingly reliable, with the simple question, how do you know? What is the basis for your opinion? I tell them to listen carefully to the answer, because distinguishing hopeful surmise on the part of their advisor, which is dogma, from acceptable hard fact, which is evidence-based, might make all the difference to their health and well-being. So it was in preparation for this debate that I started actually going to the text, and this is when my more serious study of the Rambam as a physician really started, to put this into context. Last point I want to make is another quote from him, which I think is very, very famous, and probably you all know it, because, you know, he wrote a Guide for the Perplexed in Judeo-Arabic. It had to be translated into Hebrew, which Shmuel ibn Tibbon was doing, and there were some very difficult points and he needed some help, and so he wanted to visit Rambam and get that advice. At this point, he was so immersed in medicine that he wrote, you know, after a very long day, taking care of the Sultan and his family and traveling home and eating a very little bit, then I go forth to attend to my patients and write prescriptions and directions to the various ailments. The patients go in and out until nightfall, and sometimes even, I solemnly assure you, until 2 hours or more in the night. I converse with them and prescribe for them while I die from sheer fatigue, and when night falls, I am so exhausted that I can scarcely speak. I must tell you, I think I certainly identify with this, and I think many of my physician colleagues identify with this as well. And so this is work ethic. So what have we covered? We've covered the key points that are commonly attributed in the modern world to things that William Osler wrote in the latter part of the 18th, beginning part of the 19th, latter part of the 19th, beginning part of the 20th century. The importance of work ethic, the importance of evidence-based medicine, the importance of total dedication, and the higher calling of medicine, which unites basically the biological with the spiritual. So Rambam is really, I think, really essential to a central figure and essential to the evolution of modern medicine. It clearly starts with Hippocrates, who broke from some of the demonology of the past and started characterizing diseases with an artificial system that was created that kind of made sense, including, you know, in the kind of religious worldview of the time in terms of the 4 elements and the 4 humors. Plato taught Aristotle, and Aristotle broke from Plato and says, okay, we've got to take those works from Hippocrates and start tying it to real observations. This was carried forward very dramatically in the work of Galen. It was restored and kept intact by the monks throughout Christian Europe, even though there were no major advances during that period of time. Advances occurred in the Persian world and in the Islamic world in terms of taking these same general principles, but that the resolution of the spiritual and the biological, of earth and heaven, this can really clearly be attributed to Rambam, and I can't find any sources that did it as well or as specifically, or anybody that perhaps was capable of doing this, because of his extensive knowledge of the Torah and the Talmud, and his extensive knowledge, as well as extensive knowledge of medicine as it existed at the time, is passed down to him by great physicians. And then this is basically passed down through Osler and other great teachers in the Anglophilic tradition of modern American and universal medicine. So a straight line from the ancients to our present day. And if I had to say what is the greatest achievement, there's a lot of other achievements in there, by the way: the importance of diet, the importance of exercise, the importance of psychology, psychosomatic illness, and how to treat infections, how to treat minimization of surgery and leading toward medicinal care whenever possible, and many other specific things that we can talk about for many hours. But if I had to put my finger on what really touches me the most about the work of the Rambam, is this uniting of the spiritual and the earthly, which I think creates the essence of the best part of modern medicine that we have today. Thank you all very much for listening to me. I very much appreciate it. And now we have some minutes left, and I hope that we can have some discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Norton, for that fascinating presentation. I think we all truly enjoyed. I'd just like to begin by presenting a couple of questions, and then afterwards, if Ezra has any questions, or Rachel, and then we'll begin our discussion. You mentioned that the Rambam merged, two different traditions, the evidence and the dogma together.
I can't see anybody, but that's okay. I can't. Maybe Rachel can tell me how do I get back to? There we go. Okay, thank you.
It's a webinar, so we'll just present the questions to you because that's not set up a little bit differently. Now, in your opinion, so the Rambam incorporated health guidance or guidelines within his code of Jewish law, his Yad Chazaka, which is interesting. So in your opinion, how much of his health guidelines that he included in this code of Jewish law, how much of it is based on his studies of medicine at the time, his research, and how much of it is based on traditional, analyzing the traditional rabbinic texts that maybe it comes some type of Jewish tradition from the Talmud, the Midrash, whatever, meaning is it just his own medical understanding at the time, or is he somehow combining two different facets of study?
Yeah, excellent question, and there's no question about it. There's no question that he brought his knowledge of the Jewish literature into medical decision making. But there's other really important components of that as well, which is that there's actually knowledge in the Torah that I actually find it extremely challenging to understand how it would be there were it not for some kind of divine source, all right? And and in particularly, the notion of burying, for example, hygiene, for example. I mean, that infectious disease being waterborne wasn't really clear until 1853 because of a cholera epidemic in London. And the experimental method wasn't developed for many centuries, afterward. So how would one know about the importance of hygiene for health without doing an experiment? You can't say just observing people, burying refuse outside the city, carrying a shovel, if you're traveling, so you can not have the refuse within the city, but have it outside the city, because that could be a source of infection. The question is, how would you know that? From a we're starting to get to my religious aspects of my thinking here. How would you know that without the experiment, randomizing, this town will bury its refuge outside the city, this town won't, we'll see who gets sick. That kind of experiments just weren't done. I mean, there was no way of doing them. The experimental method wasn't discovered yet. So there is intrinsic wisdom there, all right? The Rambam clearly identified as divine wisdom. And then applied that actually into his own practice, and then from observations in his own practice saw that there was validity. I think one of the major things, so the answer to your question is there's no question that there was a strong influence there very, very specifically. But also, he was a questioner, and as you know from reading, he thought that just rigorous attention to previously written texts or interpretations without a process of intellectual dissection and argument was not going to be ultimately valuable. He was a great questioner. And when he had those questions, he had real life experience that he applied it to. Is this really true? Well, let me see if it's really true. Let me see if following this advice is really going to have a major difference. And he wrote about this really extensively in all those treatises, the 10 treatises they wrote on medicine. My experience is it's based on this. I did it, and this is what I observed. Not truly experimental in terms of control groups. All right. Interestingly enough, and this is the second lecture in the series, but interestingly enough, We're now starting to return to that in modern medicine. We're doing what's called real-world evidence. And more, we can't afford basically anymore to do large randomized trials in many fields. So the concept is, if things are being done in the community, if we gather all that data and we gather enough data and we can analyze it, using the tools of modern computer science, we may be able to learn things without actually having randomization. And that, I think, has actually returned to very sophisticated, the observation approach to medicine that Galen, Aristotle, Galen, and then Maimonides really emphasized in terms of their approach. So yes, indeed, he had his roots in that learning, but that was not enough for him. He needed to apply it. He needed to prove it. And I think that the revolution for him was, I'm doing a divine service by doing this. By understanding nature from observation, I'm actually serving God, and I actually can see the wonders of God in a better way, and it makes me a better person, and it makes me a better Jew. And seeing the power of God makes me fear God more and makes me better in that respect as well. So he didn't see this as a break, which a lot of other philosophers over the years saw that. I mean, how could you possibly question the Bible? You question the Bible is going to, maybe Ezra's right. Maybe perdition is where we're all going to go in terms of that regard. He was he didn't see it that way. He thought it as an evolution of our knowledge, and as a way to be a better connected to God. So that I think is the real revolution in his thinking.
Thank you. Another follow-up question. You mentioned, you brought it up a couple of times, that the Rambam was very, very advanced in his understanding of medicine. I know he talks about how you have to be careful what you eat, and that most illnesses come from what you eat, and you have to have a healthy digestive system. So I've heard, and I think even met individuals who truly believe in the Rambam's medical doctrine, even though it was written hundreds of years ago, and even attempt to live their life by it. So to what degree was the Rambam, is his medical assessments that he includes in the Yad Hazaka and other works aligned with modern day medical theory? You mentioned a few of them, but is he, how on target was he hundreds of years ago?
The concordance is in excess of 90%.
Wow.
All right, and there have actually been papers that have actually looked at this. All right. Again, you wonder how that could happen. I mean, there are certain people through history, you just wonder how could they have accomplished all that they've accomplished, and how could he have those insights. Some of it was obviously some kind of, it could not be all based on experimental method. But remember, he was relying on a tremendous past accomplishment of others in medicine. I think that he wasn't the first physician. I mean, and particularly in the Persian and the Islamic world, there were great physicians that and I just mentioned a couple. I mean, as an example, there are great physicians that he leaned on that also made observations over many years in this regard. But the big break was, and I think this was a very important part of what he did when he did his compendium, basically, of natural products, is really medicine is. People are sick, they eat this and they feel better, all right, or they do better, as opposed to if you have too much blood and therefore you're sanguinic, you can't eat red things, all right, because red things, the red is like blood, and therefore, you're going to be promoting the blood, which was really what a lot of herbalism was like, all right, and, throughout the Middle Ages, in particular in Europe. And so the notion of observations about how people do under certain conditions, that people eating mostly plant products, are going to be healthier. He was very opposed to fatty meats, for example. It was a very, very modern concept. He called them heavy foods. And so the concordance, right? The importance of air quality. I mean, where does that come from? I mean, astonishing, a fundamental observation. The importance of exercise is that you should make sure that you do something that makes you perspire for 20 minutes every day. Which is exactly the right period of time to get cardiovascular training, the minimum time for cardiovascular training.
Actually, on that point,
right.
I wanted to ask you, and then I'll open up to Ezra and Rachel, that I was always bothered why today in modern science, they put such a focus on exercise. It's such an integral aspect, and the Rambam does bring it up, yet I'm not so familiar in rabbinic texts, traditional rabbinic texts, there's such a discussion or overemphasis on the importance of exercise. So if you could explain, meaning why historically was it not a focus on it into more Talmudic texts, and how did the Rambam, figure that
Well,
out?
I think, if you go back far enough, we all exercise a lot because we're an agricultural people, all right? So that's one thing. I mean, we're working in the fields, and so we're getting plenty of exercise just by doing our natural work. We're working around the home, for the people that would be home-based, in terms of lugging, logs and doing a lot of heavy work. So, the sedentary lifestyle is kind of an invention of the evolution of civilization. And so that really is part of it, because going back very far, from going back to original texts in that regard. But also, it's basically, again, it's evidence-based. It's not theory-based. I'll give you a very concrete example of it. And by the way, a lot of those ancient Greek ideas, Hippocratic ideas, are still carried forward. Have you ever heard feed a cold and starve a fever? That's purely 4 elements. All right. Without no basis whatsoever in any kind of objective observational science, for example. But so the importance of exercise is something. It's extremely important. It's not a trivial feature, and it's an extremely important part of of modern health. And I think that this is something he derived from observation. And that and advice, and giving people advice, exercise, and actually watching their improvement. A great observer, which all great scientists are. They just see things, and they don't have preconceived notions, which is what dogma is. They use it as a basis. But I want to emphasize something, that he was also basing a lot of his work on an extensive amount of scholarship that happened before him, that he happened to just know. Because he just knew about the Persian physicians, he knew about the Arabic physicians, he obviously knew about the herbalism of Western Europe, and his first book was about Galen, his second book was about Hippocrates, so that he knew all that, and he also knew Torah and Talmud. Nobody else can make that claim, to have that kind of breadth of knowledge, and he was also able to write books in 6 languages. So I think, when we're talking genius here, we're talking serious high-level genius. Of very few people in the history of the world could be at that level. But also, great humility and great personality, that people would want to seek him just as a conversationalist, and the ability to actually learn from experience, but integrate that in with theoretical concepts, overarching theoretical concepts, that started with Hippocrates and going on. There are diseases of the circulatory system, and there are diseases of the respiratory system, and so on. So bring that all together. So he was a genius at synthesizing these diverse things, but he also made a tremendous advance in saying all of that study is a way to God and not something that's separate from religious life, which is, I think, to me, the most remarkable part of his achievement.
Thank you. Ezra and Rachel, if you have any questions.
If I may, there's 2 things you've said, Larry, that sort of make me think a little bit. One is, the perhaps a little more difficult question is, the Rambam clearly had this enormous instinct and almost compulsion to codify. That's what the idea is. That's the entire Mishnah Torah, including its title. In the last 2 decades of his life, as his own internal camera swung to medicine, to the extent that and have familiarity with the literature, does he also try this extraordinary codification instinct? Is it as sweeping as it is in Jewish law?
He actually accomplished a lot of that in his earlier treatises, and his later treatises were more about specific illnesses and anecdotes therefrom. But the major achievement of actually taking all known medicinals that exist in the world, in all parts of the world, and actually creating a glossary of them in many languages so people refer to it, that's the ultimate. And he did it all without computers. He did it all without the internet. And I think that is all by itself. If he did nothing else but that, he'd be regarded as one of the greatest physicians of all time. So yes, the answer is absolutely yes. All right. But also, that's the basis of knowledge, and the basis of knowledge is to not only know what's out there, but be able to put it in a useful form. And that's what he did actually with his very first treatises on Galen, is called The Art of the Cure, is what he called it. And basically is that Galen wrote extensive amount of just long long discussions of things that no beginning, no middle, and the end, and really, a lifetime of work to really understood it. And he read it all, and he synthesized it. He put it together into excerpts that could be actually clinically useful.
So these are not so much commentaries as they are self-standing codes?
Yeah, they're codes with commentary.
Okay.
They're codes with commentary. It's like, familiar from the religious work. And
Right.
I think that is that, and some of them were just, frankly, really funny. I mean, comments obviously in his own language, like where'd they come up with that one, and they were actually there's a sense of humor about them as well as seriousness. And even in some of the quotes that I just gave you, believe it or not, sometimes they go 2 hours after nightfall and I'm still lying on my bed and they're still talking to me. I mean, there's a sense of humor in that, which is kind of the pinnacle of humanism in many ways, is to be able to see that life. And that's in his medical text as well.
In your talk, you made a reference, which sounded offhand, but knowing you, it's not, to his influence and the transformation of medicine for a 400-year period. Now, that may be a whole separate lecture, but I was curious to know what's the significance of the 400 years, meaning does something, as a matter of intellectual history, does something actually develop with him? I suppose one could ask tangentially whether there's a development of literature, of secondary literature, paralleling what happens to the fate of some of his works. It stops pretty early in Jewish law. And what is the transformation, and what runs out of gas after 400 years? Not that 400 years is exactly a short time, but it stops.
Well, most scientific discoveries last, if you're lucky, if it lasts a decade, all right, before somebody else proves it to be wrong or moves beyond this. So that's by itself a remarkable feat. Look, my point is, my uber point before we get to that specific is that he's still influencing medicine today. We're still struggling with evidence-based versus opinion-based medicine, and that's the essay that I wrote, and that's when I started actually studying his work to be able to write that essay. Doctor, why are you doing this? Well, I've always done it this way, and it's always worked. I mean, that's dogma. Or I read it in a textbook, and therefore it's got to be true. That's dogma, all right, as opposed to experimental method, as opposed to based on observation, and we're still in a period where evidence-based medicine is still not, it's dominant, but it's still not universal. And I think that's a very important part of, so the argument is still going on in that regard. His book on poisons was an official textbook in medical schools throughout Europe and throughout the Islamic and the Persian world for about 200 years, because it was a guide to physiology and pharmacology. It was a pharmacological text. How do chemicals interact one with the other? And eventually science went past it, not conceptually, but science went past it because of techniques, because of new approaches, new tools that could be applied to the problem of drugs and the biological action. It was his glossary that lasted about 400 years, and the only reason that it went out of favor is because some medicinals dropped out and new medicinals got added in, so it became kind of dated.
There's nothing only about 400 years.
And also the fact is that there's other things too, is that largely because in the Christian world of Europe, Latin became the universal language in medicine. You spoke the vernacular to your patients, but you did all your studies really in Latin, and so you didn't need something that had Berber or Syrian in it. In that regard, Arabic became the dominant language in other parts of the world that were influenced by him, and so the notion of translation from language to language became less important. But actually doing a work like that lasts for 400 years is just all by itself a totally remarkable achievement.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Norton. Some questions now have started coming in from our audience, so I'll share some of those. The first one is, was the Rambam's rationalism in halakha influenced by his scientific and medical background, or the reverse?
I can't really. That's something I'm not enough of a scholar to know, frankly. I don't want to. I mean, I want to express my own humility in this regard, because I focused in my energies really on his medical writing and his medical scholarship. And I think there's probably people there listening to this who can use what I've said and my insights on the medicine side to see how it informed interpretation. But his use of logic, of logical deduction in medicine, of going from major premise to minor premise and equality of ideas, something that really started with Aristotle, that he brought to an extremely high level in its application to medicine. I'm sure that that same style of thinking was extremely important. But in his religious writings, and look, some of the quotes I gave you were not from his Mishnah Torah and from Guide for the Perplexed. These are religious works. These are not medical works, and nevertheless, he talks about medicine within them. So that I think there was a great deal of my own suspicion is there's a great deal of fertilization. But to get the more specifics, for that I have to talk to people who know much more than I do.
Well, I think that answer ties in a little bit to another question that's in the Q&A, which says, what can you learn from Rambam's methodologies for today's world, not only in medicine, but problem solving in general?
I wrestle all the time. I can't say every day, but at least once or twice a month with this notion of people feeling guilty that they're ill because they did something bad and they're being punished, rather than a purely biological phenomenon that can occur, a random mutation in DNA, for example. People thinking that prayer is the answer to their illness rather than medicinals, which comes up not remarkably often, actually, in things, and other various specifics. And I talk to people about Rambam. I basically talk to him about the fact that is that we're not talking about separate things, and they say, well, why should I listen to you? I can read the Bible. Why should I listen to you? And I said, where do you think my knowledge comes from? I mean, my knowledge is not, I'm not a creator. I'm a product of creation. And so my knowledge is coming from somewhere, and it's coming from deep roots that are spiritual roots. Mm-hmm. And so maybe God is speaking to me maybe God is speaking to you through me, perhaps. Maybe you should consider that as a possibility, which is very similar to some of the quotes that we get from Rambam. So those things help me a lot in my relationships with patients. And I think that that's something that I think is extremely important. Clearly, a lot of his observations, have stood the test of time. I'm a great believer in scientific advances by observations, by the experimental method, but I think that the overarching philosophy of medicine is the more important part of his accomplishments to me. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And also, and the other thing is, the recognition of the relationship between the personality and the illness, psychosomatic meditation, psychology. Maybe that's something based on his own life, his own awareness, that he went through a period of mental illness himself after his father and his brother died, and he was left destitute and had to support these individuals. Maybe that informed his desire to help people in similar circumstances. It's hard for me to believe that it didn't, but I think those are the overarching things about Rambam to me, rather than specific discoveries.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I was really fascinated by how individualized the approach was that he took to his patients. You mentioned the psychological aspects. In addition to knowing a medical history, he felt that it was important to understand the patient's psychological disposition, important to inspire confidence in the patient so that they would be receptive to his advice. It really carries over into a very patient-oriented medical education or practice. And I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on his relationship with his patients.
Well, I remember that's where, obviously, he got into Cairo in his late 20s, not totally clear because on the day of his birth. In his late 30s, he becomes the physician to the royal court. He loses about a year with his own illness, and then he comes back. So in the space of less than a decade, he has earned enough of a reputation as a physician, as a hands-on physician, to get the highest calling in the land. All right, I mean, that's pretty amazing, even itself. And by the way, and he's competing with people who had formal medical education in Alexandria, which was the major medical school, which is just a few miles away from Cairo. So that and everybody would be vying for this incredible the honor of that particular position. So obviously it was more than his medical knowledge; it was also his personality and his ability to relate to people and talk to people. All evidence is that he was extremely well liked, for example, by everybody, by the Christian world, by the Jewish world, obviously, and by the Islamic world as well. And so he. That part of it is very clear. But he was interested, obviously, in the person's psychology, and he says you can't have. But a lot of that was derived also from his knowledge of the Greek healthy mind and healthy body kind of concept. But remember where he was coming from. You're sick, and you go to the island of Kos to get better, and you go to the temple, all right, and you talk to a priest, and the priest says, "Well, tell me about your dreams." Okay. Oh, your dreams are just filled with images of green. We have to balance it with. That means you have too much yellow bile, and then so we have to balance it, with some herbs that have this color, and you have to do certain things, and you can't do other things. I mean, having nothing to do with the person's diet and lifestyle and the air that they breathe or the psychological state. It's very removed from that. It's a very depersonalized kind of system. And even taking it forward, into Galen, for example, which was the basis, and Rambam thought extremely highly of Galen. I mean, he thought that he was the greatest physician of all time. In fact, even though he was personally exposed to a lot of great physicians from the Persian and the Islamic world, I mean, the reason why you're sociable is because the predominance of blood. You're sanguinic. Is that it's related to your humor. It's not related to your past life experiences or other things in your environment. In other words, yes, it's an organic basis. There's an advance there, but also it's attributing the personality to to nebulous things that can't be measured fundamentally, in that regard as a method of classification, as a method of taxonomy. So he's coming from really in that tradition, and then he's becoming a great humanist in that period of time. I think some of it is if you read the writings of some of the Islamic physicians that he was exposed to, either in writing or his own very brief period of contact, I can't even call it training, with Averroes, again, the humanism was really part of that as well. So he took a lot of things that already existed and he brought it to a higher level. There's no question about about that. But his ability to synthesize all these points is the thing that really makes him remarkable.
Yeah, he really truly seemed to be a Renaissance man. Do you think that today
long before the Renaissance.
Yeah, it's really an era now of increased specialization, and do you think that hurts or helps the patients today?
Boy, that's lecture 3. It all depends on how it's done. And I think we're wrestling with it now. We're trying to see how to make it work. I think a lot of people are hoping that somehow, digital communications is going to be the answer there. And we talked about it a little bit when we talked about telemedicine very earlier. But you're also seeing fragmentation of care even within one specialty. You have the physician, but then you have nurse practitioners, you have RNs, and you have various clerical people that are doing specific things. You've got somebody who's a specialist in the drawing of blood. In the operating room, you have people that are physician assistants who open to get down to the organ that has to be operated on, and then come out again and close the skin. That's not being done by the surgeon. So we're getting a lot of ancillary personnel, and I think that there is this great danger of these individuals not being well connected enough, so that you actually get mistakes made because of poor communication, because of fragmentation of care. I think it's one of the great dangers of modern medicine. Rambam didn't have to worry about that. Obviously, they were coming to him, they spoke to him, and he made his recommendations. But I think that's something that we're going to have to deal with in the modern world. And that's one thing and that's just because of the knowledge. The knowledge that's necessary to take care of the patient. You can't be an expert in everything anymore, and you have to be very, very focused to be able to do part of the comprehensiveness of medical care, to be able to do it really, really perfectly. And that's going to be one of the things that we're going to have to deal with moving off into, as the world of medicine really evolves. So you're identifying that properly is a great challenge. And the other, by the way, is just, and I know it's technical, but it's beyond technical, is to move away from organ systems into molecules. I think is obviously a revolution that's currently happening. And that is going to fundamentally change how physicians and nurses and other people really trained and how they really focus. It's more the medical decision making going to be made by laboratory tests and by machines, artificial intelligence and machine learning, that are giving lists of things to actually humans, physicians, to be able to go through and sift through and be able to make decisions. I think more and more that's the case. This is another great, just like the 12th century was a great period of change in medicine, I think that this century is also a great period of change in that regard.
Speaking of change, as he became a prominent physician, he also, as you obviously know, had so many other responsibilities within the Jewish world as rabbi, as judge, as chief administrative officer. And it did occur to me that he might have appreciated the efficiency of telemedicine. I mean, his terrible stories about his fatigue at the end of the day.
Yeah, well, that's his famous letter, and that's what I read at the end of it. But he was also taking care of very prominent people, all right, and that's another extremely time-consuming part of what he had to do, and prominent people's families, and then everybody else came to him as well. So the whole city of Cairo came to him basically because he was in such great renown as a physician. So the guy was pretty busy.
Not the whole city, I guess, because you mentioned he didn't take care of any women.
He did not take care of women.
Who was taking care of the women?
It's not totally all clear. Other women. It's not totally all clear, but male physicians, they were herbalists. And it's not clear. As you know, Rachel, and I hate to say it, but you know it as well, is that much of history is the history of men. And there's a lot that we don't know about the history of women. And that's actually one of the, and there's been some things written about it, and I've read some things about it, but largely the physicians were men, and they took care of men.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, this was, I have hours of questions left, but I don't want to impose on your time. We're so grateful that you were with us again tonight.
Okay. Totally my pleasure. Totally my pleasure. Thank you all. Thanks for inviting me.
Our honor.
Dr. Norton, I just had one final question for you before we conclude. It's more of a personal question from your career.
Remember, you got 43 people here, so be careful what you say.
Yeah. No, it's not too personal. And that you did quote, and the Rambam famously writes that one of the ways to come to love Hashem is by studying the world. The world is designed magnificently. Things appear to be orderly. You cut your finger, you put a Band-Aid on, and your finger heals itself. My tire has a flat tire; it doesn't heal itself.
Right.
So in your career, as a doctor, for yourself and interacting with your colleagues and your students, does it ever come up that someone just says, "Wow, like the body is just so magnificent," that how organized it is, how efficient it is, how it seems to be carefully designed? In your interaction with for years of students and colleagues, does this question ever come up? Like, wow, could this just be random, or is it really designed?
Oh, you mean in terms of, you're talking about, creation versus...
No, meaning the fact that the body, the Rambam is talking about creation at large, but it definitely applies to the human body as well. It seems to be organized, designed in a very magnificent way. So in your interaction with doctors, does this ever come up that someone acknowledges this or appreciates this?
I'm going to get into terrible trouble with the answer. No matter how I answer that question, I'm going to get into terrible trouble. All right, but I'm in a synagogue environment, so I feel somewhat protected. In this regard, I think the evidence in favor of evolution is huge. All right, and is incontrovertible. I mean, in that regard. I don't see that in any way different than than the Almighty creating life. All right, it just created it with the tool of evolution, and I think that was as a technique moving forward. That's how I resolve it, and in my own mind, and I don't see any real difference there. And by the way, is that this is I was a very prominent colleague. There was a debate going on where there was a very strong, going back about 15 years or so, a very strong anti-science movement that was starting to impact on our world, and still is in terms of, many people believe that, science is actually anti-religion, and so, the notion that science and religion are the same thing, is a very Jewish idea basically, and I think it's something that could be very helpful in healing, moving off into the world. But having said this, I will just tell you a little with 42 of my very best friends here, tell you a little secret. I was hearing a Nobel laureate present at a meeting, not the Nobel lecture, but present at a at a meeting shortly after winning the Nobel Prize. A friend of mine. This is many years ago, he was presenting a very, very complicated piece of science. And I won't say what branch of science because that might be a giveaway. And you know, and showed all the elaborate connections between, you know, anatomy and physiology and biology and chemistry, and a brilliant lecture. And then he sat down next to me, you know, and there was several other lecturers. I was going to be lecturing a little bit later than that. He says, Larry, you know, it's just hard to believe that all of that happened just by evolution. You know, like, you know, by random chance, that all those pieces could fall into place so precisely. There's not enough time since, you know, from the beginning of you know, of the first piece of DNA in the oceans, for that to have evolved that degree of complexity, you know, strictly by random chance. And he says, and I agreed with him. So, you know, so basically we don't have all the answers, and you know, you know, and I think that is and that's something that I, you know, I keep you know, in the back of the mind. So there's a little bit of a dirty secret that runs through all of our minds in this regard. Nevertheless, there is such a thing as evolution, and really did occur. And whether that is a tool by which you know, Hashem has actually created, you know, the modern biological world, is something that that gives me some comfort when I actually think about trying to reconcile my religious views and my scientific knowledge.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
All right.
So, I want to thank Ezra again, and Lauren and Rachel, and thank you all for joining us, and to making this evening so meaningful for us, Dr. Norton. I think it was a very, very special presentation.
Okay. Thank you all very much. Thank you, and good night.
Right.
Bye-bye.